Boylei Hobby Time challenged me and a number of other channels to create a collaboration based on a Star Wars Kitbash droid. And I thought, Samurai Star Wars mashup. The first thing I needed was something I could kitbash into this droid. Something like a glue stick or a glue bottle, but I couldn't find the right one, so after a lot of rummaging through my drawers, I found the perfect size. Perfect. I cleaned off the label using isopropyl alcohol, sawed the top off, and then sanded it to make sure the glue had something to grip to. I found this, I think it's out of a paint cap, and decided that could be the rocket booster. To give it the samurai feel, I used cocktail sticks. They're just about the right shape to represent bamboo. I sanded to make sure the glue would grip and just glued them in place with super glue. Samurai armour has a lot of bindings, so I used cotton thread for that. I secured the first end with super glue and just wrapped it around, snipped it to length and put a little bit more super glue on. Just repeat at the top. I made the legs from bits of styrene. I cut 4 rectangles of 2mm styrene, trimmed the top with a knife and then sanded everything nice and smooth. This took a while. Eventually I got bored of sanding and broke out the Dremel. I used a slitting disc to cut a section away so I could put in a pneumatic tube front before using the plain sanding bit just to smooth everything off. Eventually though, I had to go back to sanding by hand. I started with 120 grit and ended up with 1500. I tacked the two together so that they were identical, so I split them apart and sanded it before using a piece of styrene rod to create a pneumatic tube, before gluing it in place. To hide where it joined the bottom, I used cord along the samurai theme. I wanted to add some surface detail, so I did that using scribing tape to mark a line and then scribing it with some new DSPIAE, however you pronounce that, DSPI, brooches that I've got, which are brilliant for cutting lines into plastic surfaces, and then I drilled a few holes. The bottom of this type of droid's legs splay out a little, so I used the pointy end of a cocktail stick to add the sort of flare out, measured the distance I needed and cut some little rectangles to go at the bottom out of thin styrene. I added a spacer so that the cocktail sticks had something to rest on and glued them all in place using super glue. I glued some cord in place at the bottom, you know, just because, samurai and all that, and added cotton near the top. I drilled a mounting hole for a piece of styrene tube at the top, probably should have done this before I put the feet on, and drilled a hole through the glue bottle too. I test fit but left them separate for painting. I wanted to add some wiring for detail, so I used some thin pieces of styrene tube as a kind of place for the wiring to go into, drilled some holes and then just used cotton. Super glue zapper is definitely your friend here. Then I stiffened everything up into a nice shape with more super glue. Now onto the arms. I wanted to make sure that they were easy to take on and off, so I used magnets. I drilled holes in the glue bottle and then actually I mounted the magnets first onto little discs of styrene that I used a hole punch to cut out. I put them on double-sided sticky tape and then used epoxy glue to glue magnets on. This way I could make sure they were all the right way round, and the styrene discs ensure that something is glued around the edge of the magnet to the glue bottle, leaving them nice and firm. I glued more magnets to discs, making sure they attracted to the ones on the body and they were the right way round, before using styrene rod to create the arms. This time I used thinner styrene rod in lieu of the bamboo. The bamboo sticks were just a little bit too big on this point, so I had to go with something thinner. I left a hole at the top for the magnet, which I epoxied in place. Then I wrapped cord around several times to create a nice little samurai detail-ish. More styrene rod for the lower arms, and it was time to break out the 3D prints. I designed these shurikens in Blender and printed them, way too small to start with, so then I printed them a lot bigger and used those smaller ones on the elbows. I also did some pliers, evil looking pliers. And for the front, a few roundels with the Imperial logo. Whilst I was at it, a Japanese hat-inspired head. More on that later. So I glued the mini shurikens in place. I drilled a small hole in the end of some styrene rod. Just like the legs, I added some wiring using cotton and styrene strip. Finally the hands, more styrene rod and some discs that I'd hole punched and drilled a hole in. A dab of super glue secured the 3D prints. The head is a 3D print, so I started off by sanding it. Note it's done in clear resin so the lights can shine through. Then I glued it in place with some epoxy. And now to give him some samurai armour. I use these, they're from a Will's girder bridge kit and I have tons of them left. I think they're basically supposed to be a cast iron strip with rivets. I cut more pieces down to size and glued them into vertical panels. I glued them onto the vertical strips that were there. There's 2 of them front and back. And for variety, I added some thin strips of styrene to give a smooth finish that I could paint a stripe on. This layer of plastic was far too thick for the magnets to work through, so I went through and sanded those areas flat so the arms have like a little armhole. More epoxy and the roundels were put in place. Finally, I sanded the bottom flat. Then it was time to paint. A good clean and it was off to the spray booth. The eyes got a spray of all-clad aqua gloss to give them a nice shine. I sprayed everything else with all-clad black micro filler and primer, mostly because I wanted it for the metallic parts. The metallic areas got a spray of all-clad black gloss and then all-clad dura-aluminium. Aqua gloss sealed it all in. Time to mask. I put a glove on so I don't get any fingerprints on my existing paint. I wanted a 3mm strip and I only had that in curved Tamiya tape, so that's what I used. It's a bit harder to get it to go straight. The roundels got Mr. Masking Neo just on the raised areas, dabbed on with a cocktail stick. And finally the whole of the eye area got masking tape. Tamiya is the largest one I had. I decided it was easier to pan paint it than to mask it. Back to the airbrush booth and Mr. Surfacer 1000 on the head, which hasn't been primed yet. Then everything got a spray with Mr. Colour Tire Black. I top coated with Mr. Colour Flat and I was done. Then the satisfying bit of peeling off your masking tape. The Mr. Masking just rubs off. I hand painted around the lenses. The black needs to stop the light from leaking, so it's really important. So I also put a coat of black on the inside to stop it leaking through the paint on the top. I dry brushed a lighter grey to bring out the rivet details and repeated on all the edges of the other pieces. I hand painted the silver detailing on any of the cords that I needed and used a black Tamiya Panaline accent to add just definition around the lenses and also to add shadows in on his samurai armour areas. And when that was dry, I put him all together. But now he needs a display for him and his friends. So I started off with veneer. I want this to have a dojo feel, like a samurai dojo. They've been practicing their arts. I prepared my veneer by putting a bit of sticky back plastic on just to give it some rigidity. This is just normal veneer I got off Amazon, 0.5 to 0.7mm, and it will cut with a Brother Scan and Cut or probably a Cry Cut machine as well. The good thing about the Brother Scan and Cut is I can just trace a picture from the internet of a corridor, scan the base, the map that it's on, and then just line it up and set it to print. I actually put it to go 3 times. You don't need the sticky back plastic when it's done, and if you do it 3 times it will easily have cut through all of this wood and you can just pop things out. If not, a knife will free it up for you. Then I stained it with 2 coats of a Peruvian mahogany Colron wood dye. I cut up loads of coffee stirrers, mostly because they're incredibly cheap to build the diorama out of, shoved them in a bag of wood dye to stain them to match, and tipped them out to dry. I built a base using 5mm foamed PVC board. The LED strip is going to light everything. It's easy to get 12V supplies and a plug you can wire in, just screws into your LED strip. Time to test. Ooh, that's bright. I cut a hole in the back for the plug laid out the LED strip and hot glued it in place. It's sticky stuff on the back, it just isn't strong enough, especially with the corners on this, and it kept popping off. Then I just assembled it all with hot glue. I used the coffee stirrers to frame the top and bottom and to hide the gaps between the sheets of veneer. I used short lengths of coffee stirrer to add some much needed height at the top of the diorama. Coffee stirrers can be a little springy, they're not quite straight, so I made sure everything was well weighted whilst it dried. I'm using baking paper to sort of add a glow, a yellowish glow, and diffuse the light a little. So I used double-sided sticky tape to stick it on. It's not the stickiest thing, it is for non-stick baking, but it does give a lovely effect here. I had an epic fail though trying to use more double-sided sticky tape to attach this piece to a piece of clear acetate to go behind to give it some rigidity. So in the end I resorted to hot glue. I added 8 layers of plate packing material to diffuse the LEDs again. I don't want to see a single spot of LED light on this. Then I just hot glued everything together. I got a picture of a tatami mat, which is on the floor in a dojo, from the internet and tiled it together in Photoshop and then just cut it out to fit the space that I had on the floor. And when I'd done all that, I realised I'd forgotten the LEDs. So I got out a tea light. This collaboration was brought together by Boylei Hobby Time, and he is a huge fan of tea lights. This is my little homage to him. Nothing says evil like pink, so I used pink LEDs, some reed switches, and cut down the tea light so it fitted in my gap. I soldered up the reed switch on one side and then soldered directly to the batteries on the other, and hey presto, lights. I cut some space in the top to fit this down because the top actually wasn't sitting properly, and then glued some spacers and then LEDs in place. I hot glued a magnet, which is what you use to turn the light on, and I was done. This has been such a fun little project to do, and it was great to collaborate with some awesome channels, so make sure you go and check their videos out too. Links are in the description. And remember, subscribe, hit the bell button so you know when videos are coming, and if you want to support me to do more videos like this, I've got Patreon and YouTube memberships. Otherwise, see you next time, and I do have some more Samurai Star Wars planned.